proposal that became our preamble. And Bob was one of my closest and dearest friends in the Constitutional Convention, and he died just this last year, right before our 50th reunion. But he was such a jokester, and one of the last things he did was he gave me this. Meaning is still the youngest. Well, it's kind of hard to believe, isn't it? You're only 9 of us 100 left, so it's really an honor for me on behalf of the other delegates to share with you a little bit about this state constitution and why we have it. And I think it's important to start off with maybe just a little civics lesson. Why do we need state constitutions? There are 2 reasons, really. You cannot be admitted, a territory couldn't be admitted to the United States without a constitution. Secondly, under the U.S. Constitution, all powers that are not specifically delegated to the United States government are reserved to the states. So believe it or not, about 92% of the laws and regulations you live under derive from state and local government and not the federal government. So state constitutions are important. Montana became a territory in 1866. And from 1866 to 1889, the primary focus of the Montana territorial government was to become a state. Thomas Marr was our first appointed territorial governor, and if you haven't read the book, The Immortal Irishman, which is a biography of Thomas Marr, I heartily recommend it. He called it for a constitutional convention in 1866. They gathered, they wrote the Constitution, they sent it to St. Louis to be printed so it could be voted on by the people, and it got lost. Yeah, it got lost. So that Constitution never got voted on. It wasn't until 1884 that another attempt was made for Montana to have a constitution. By then, the population had significantly increased. So 45 delegates got together that year, 1884. The president of that constitutional convention was none other than William Andrews Clark, another notorious Montanan that's worth reading about, and Marcus Daly was also a delegate to that 1884 Constitution. And it was a constitution that pretty much protected the rights of the mining industry and the banking industry. Joseph Toole, our governor, presented it to Congress, but Congress would not accept it. And the reason for that, and this is an interesting bit of history, I think, from 1866 to 1889, Montana was a very strongly Democratic state. William Andrews Clark was a Democrat. In order to be admitted to statehood, both the House and the U.S. Senate had to approve the admission. The U.S. Senate was Republican, the U.S. House was Democratic. The Senate wouldn't vote to admit any Democratic states, the House wouldn't vote to admit any Republican states. So there was a period of 5 years where no states were admitted to the Union for purely political reasons. In 1889, it became pretty clear that something needed to be done. These states really were clamoring for statehood, and both parties adopted political platforms that would allow statehood. And the President Grover Cleveland signed a bill inviting Montana and these other states that were trying to come in to have constitutional conventions. Immediately, a convention was called in Montana, consisting of 75 delegates, again chaired by William Andrews Clark. They, in 40 days, created a constitution. It was ratified by the voters, 26,000 to 2,000. So eager was our state for constitution, or for statehood, and we became the 41st state in November of 1889. That constitution, its sole purpose really was for statehood. It was not a constitution that was designed for effective government. Honestly, and all of the historians will point out, the powers that be didn't really want an effective state government because they didn't want to be interfered with in what they were doing. They even wrote into that 1889 Constitution that there could be no tax on mines. The only time they also wrote into that Constitution that they had the ability to go across people's property to get to water for mining water. It was not a document that really favored good government. One of the big things under that Constitution is our legislature met every other year for 60 days. They almost never were able to get their business done, particularly through the 50s and 60s as government became more complicated. They would have to put a towel or butcher paper over the clock to stop the time from passing. They didn't get paid after 60 days. So there were many, many times when the business of the state could not get done without special sessions. They were poorly paid, and it was not a very functioning legislature. The governor was also a very weak body under that original Constitution. In 1970, there were over 151 independent boards that made decisions in the state, like fish and game, like highway, like mining, everything. And those boards were appointed by citizens. And so the governor, there was really no accountability because he, and I would say he or she being correct, but there were no she's. So there was just no accountability whatsoever. But things started changing in Montana in the late 60s. One of the things that had kept Montana's government so entrapped was the Anaconda Copper Company. There was an article in a publication called Inside USA in 1947. It says, Anaconda, a company aptly named, has a constrictor-like grip on much that goes on. And Montana is the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. Anaconda owned almost all of the newspapers. They were wheat newspapers. There's been a book published by the University of Montana that referred to the press as the Copper Chorus. In 1957, an article appeared in The Economist that says, Montana newspaper readers are worse informed about their own affairs than the inhabitants of any other state. So when you think back about this period, Montana was under the copper collar. Lee Enterprises bought out the Anaconda papers beginning in 1959, and then they started hiring good reporters who started trying to figure out what was going on in our government. Because truthfully, most of the government that was occurring at that time was behind the scenes. There was no open meeting law. There was no obligation for recorded votes. So things were changing. One of the really big changes that happened in Montana politics was as a result of a Supreme Court case called Reynolds versus Sims in 1964. Under our 1889 Constitution, every county had one senator. So Yellowstone County, which had 79,000 people at the time, had one senator. And Petroleum County, which had 894 people, had one senator. So the court said, basically, the court said, you can't have senators representing cows. They have to represent people. So that made a significant change, as you can imagine, as the state senate had to be based on population rather than the county itself. Other changes were going on in the late 60s too. First Earth Day, civil rights movement, student protest over the Civil War. We lowered our voting age in Montana to 19 from 21. So those changes, in addition to the fact that the legislature commissioned a study about our Constitution to see whether or not our Constitution was able and to function well for us in the state at that time. They held that no, that 1968 legislature had a commission that they appointed which said the Constitution basically needed to be rewritten. So they submitted to the voters of the state in 1969, they put a referendum on the ballot whether or not to call a constitutional convention. The Montana voters approved that by a 65 to 35% margin, which was really quite significant at the time. The 1971 legislature set in motion the election for the delegates. There were to be 100 delegates elected across the state based on population. They said there would be 60 days in which to write the Constitution. They appropriated $500,000 to cover the cost, $150,000 to do all the preparatory work, research papers, hiring research analysts, and they allocated $41,000 for the ratification effort once the Constitutional Convention was completed. So the delegates were elected in the fall of 1971. 515 people applied for those, or ran for those 100 seats. At the same time, and on the same ballot, was a very significant issue that I think affected the outcome of how the delegates, or who was elected delegates. There was a revenue shortfall in Montana in 1971. The House Republicans wanted to solve that with a sales tax. The Democrats and our Governor Forrest Anderson opposed a sales tax. So they had two special sessions trying to get enough money to balance the budget for the state to run. The legislators themselves could not agree, so they submitted it to the voters whether to have a sales tax or not. And so that was on the same ballot as the ballot for electing these 100 delegates. So the voters got to choose between keeping a 40% income tax surcharge or enacting a 2% sales tax. So people were very, very up in arms. Two groups were formed. Save Our State, which was the pro-sales tax group, and COST, Citizens Opposed to Sales Tax, was the other group. The voters overwhelmingly rejected the sales tax, 70 to 30%. So at that election, out of these 100 delegates, 58 Democrats were elected, 36 Republicans, I was one of those Republicans, and 6 independents. Most people think that had the sales tax not been on the ballot, which was so favored, so opposed by the Democrats, that perhaps that many Democrats may not have been elected. But as I'll tell you in a minute, the partisan thing didn't really matter anyway. One of the most significant things, I think, that affected the makeup of the convention was the Supreme Court had said sitting legislators could not run. So when the legislators passed this bill calling for a constitutional convention, most of them thought they would be able to run. The Supreme Court said they could not. That had 2 major consequences. One, I think it opened up the road or way for more women to run, because there were only 2 women in the whole 150 members of the state legislature, so there were no incumbent women. So I think it opened the doors to women, and 2, what it did is there was no built-in relationship between the corporate lobbyists and the delegates. If there had been leftover legislators who had been there before, the lobbyists would have had already ties and relationships. And as a result, the power of corporate lobbyists was significantly declined or decreased during the convention. They were actually barred from the floor itself, and for the first time, they were required to report any expenditures that they made, and the legislature didn't require that until 1980. Out of the 515 persons that ran for the convention, there were 247 Democrats, 232 Republicans, 32 independents, and 4 new reform delegates. Out of the 100 that were elected, 24 lawyers, 9 farmers and ranchers, 14 educators, 11 homemakers, 2 bankers, 5 ministers, a beekeeper, a radio disc jockey, a retired FBI, and I was a student. So there was a huge cross-section of people writing this Constitution for our state. Many had previous experience on local government, particularly the women. They had, even though they hadn't been on statewide office, they had been mayors, city council people, county commissioners. There was the oldest delegate, who was a retired librarian from Missoula, Lucille Spear. She was 73, and I was the youngest delegate at 24. Just an overview, there were 25 Catholics, 13 Presbyterians, 12 Methodists, 10 Lutherans, 9 Episcopalians, and the average number of children was 6. There were some big families at this convention.
Wow.
There were no Native American delegates, and one of the reasons for that is that we ran on county-wide districts. Meaning, so, just think of this, I'll give you Missoula as an example. When we ran for the Constitutional Convention, Missoula was entitled to 8 seats. So there were 24 people running for these 8 seats. You, as the voter, had to vote for 8, I mean, you didn't have to vote for 8 people, but you could vote for 8 people. And so you think, oh, that you had to review 24 candidates, pick out the 8 that you wanted. It was hard with those big county-wide districts for Native Americans, because at the time they only posed 7% of the population to be able to be elected. So there had been only one Native American lawmaker in 1971, and last year and the year before last, there were 12. The big change there was we went for single member districts. And Jeanette Rankin came and spoke to our convention, and that was one of the things that she really urged us to do because she thought it would create more Native American representation, make it cheaper for people to run, and open it up to more minorities and women. So simplistically put, right now, you vote for one person in your county for your representative. And same in Missoula, instead of voting for 8 people, you vote for one, and the districts are much, much smaller. I can see I'm already running a lot out of my time, so I want to just go to some really, I mean, I think all this has been interesting, but there's more interesting things too. We were elected on the basis of party, but after the very first day, we decided we were not going to operate on a partisan basis. This wasn't to be a Democratic Constitution or a Republican Constitution. Neither party took any positions about what should be in this Constitution. So we voted have no caucuses, we voted to seat ourselves alphabetically, and it made all the difference in the world, I think, just in terms of the collegiality, the ability to compromise, the ability to treat one another as equals without any labels. Every meeting was held in public, no lobbyists on the floor. We solicited ideas from citizens. We got over 1,500 letters with suggestions. All of those were considered in hearings. Every single meeting, I mentioned, was open to the public, and that requirement carried through in what we proposed in the Constitution. We kept every single thing in the old Bill of Rights that was in the 1899 Constitution, but added the explicit right of privacy, the right to a clean and healthful environment, a right to equality. Keep in mind at this time, the Equal Rights Amendment for women had not been passed or added to the United States Constitution. The right for people to participate in the government, the public's right to know, with the right to attend meetings and examine documents, unless the right of privacy exceeded that. We strengthened the legislature, we strengthened the governor. Up until that time, you could have a governor and lieutenant governor who were on different tickets. They didn't run together. We increased the years for the Supreme Court justices from 6 to 8. Two really big changes, I think. We made it easy to amend this Constitution, and I think, again, we'll talk a little bit about that now because we know that there are a number of amendments being proposed to the Constitution. I think we realize that we may not have it perfectly right, and that the citizens had the right to change this Constitution, and we shouldn't make it too hard. We provided that every 20 years, automatically, people would have an opportunity to decide whether to have another constitutional convention. So there was a vote in 1990 where 82% said no, we do not want another constitutional convention. By 2010, that vote had lessened. It was 59% no and 41 yes. And the next scheduled election on whether to have a constitutional convention will be in 2030. So unless the legislature, by a supermajority vote of 100, calls for a constitutional convention earlier, which they could do. In the Revenue and Finance article, there are a couple of really important things, I think, and think one of the things really scared the voters in the ratification effort. We indicated that state property across the state, the values had to be equalized. At that point in time, you could own a house in one county and a house in another county that was very similar, and your tax liability could be totally different. And part of it was because whether you knew the county assessor or didn't know the county assessor, and because they were all elected by popular vote. So that was a very significant change to try to equalize the tax burden across the state. We also set up a system where the budgets had to be balanced. There's some significant changes, I think, in the natural resources article. In addition to granting the right to a clean and healthy environment and telling the legislature that they had to implement that, there was a requirement that all land taken by surface mining had to be reclaimed. This was a really important issue for people in the eastern part of our state because of strip mining of coal was going on, and I mean there were other kind of mining going on too, but there was no requirement at all that it had to be reclaimed. Now the legislature had the authority to do that, but they never did, and the feeling was they were just too beholden to the corporate and business interests to require that. So for that reason, and I think a good reason, we put it in the Constitution that they had to reclaim that land. In addition, we claimed the water rights for the state of Montana for the first time. The 100 delegates at the end of we finished this in 54 days, 6 days before our allotted 60 days. All 100 delegates signed the Constitution. It was a very memorable, solemn experience. Our names were called one by one, and we went up and affixed our names to the Constitution. And we adjourned, and we had until June 6th to convince the voters of Montana to approve the Constitution. I want to grab one quick thing. Every voter of the state got a pamphlet like this that, on the first page of it, that explained the new Constitution, the differences between the old Constitution, goes through one by one, the preamble, the compact with the United States, and then it even had the ballot. Every single person got this document. We were allotted $41,000 to do the ratification effort, but we were sued, and it was prohibited that we couldn't use taxpayer money to promote the Constitution. So one of our delegates, Betty Babcock, who was the wife of the then governor and delegate, she took it on herself to raise money to help us promote the Constitution. So on June 6th, across the state, we had this election, and the vote was very close. I'm going to just look the numbers again because it was really close. 415,000 in favor, 113,883 against. It passed by 2,532 votes. That is close. So immediately there was a lawsuit that the Constitution didn't pass. And the old Constitution just said it had to pass by a simple majority. So why didn't it pass? Well, here's what happened. So on our ballot, I think we were a pretty progressive bunch of people, but we were somewhat conservative too, and we thought there were some issues that there was far from unanimous agreement on. One was gambling. Should we legalize gambling? One was the death penalty. Should we abolish the death penalty? The other was to have either a unicameral legislature, kind of like the Constitutional Convention was a unicameral body, or a bicameral. So we decided, let's give the voters an opportunity to vote on those, because I think we knew if we repeal the death penalty, there might be some people who just voted straight away against the Constitution, even if there were other things good in it. Likewise, we were afraid about gambling too. So those were on the ballot as side issues. But everybody got a copy of the ballot and an explanation of the ballot. And it says, the ballot has 4 sections. In the first section, the voter will have the opportunity to vote for or against the Constitution. Thereafter, 3 separately submitted propositions, the voter may select either alternative. The 3 alternative issues do not affect the present Constitution. If adopted by a majority of those voting at the election, they will only become effective if the proposed Constitution is passed. The voter should vote on all questions regardless of whether he votes for or against the proposed Constitution. Well, what happened? There were a lot of people from, and is anybody here from you?
Everybody.
People from you were really in favor of gambling. And so a whole bunch of people voted for gambling, but they didn't vote for the Constitution. So we were immediately sued that the Constitution didn't pass because you had, if you looked at all of the people voting as opposed to looking at the people voting for the Constitution, it didn't pass by a majority because all of these gambling votes. So the court had to decide, did it pass? So the court said the question it had to be approved by a majority of those voting on the question of the approval or not. The ballot was really clear. So our Supreme Court said yes, it passed, but only by a 3-2 majority. It was appealed to the federal court. It went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, who denied hearing it. So the Constitution, almost 2 years later, really, before we had a final determination that the Constitution passed. So I guess the lesson always is read the ballot. All right, my time's up. What's my final word? Where's Doug? Where's Doug? Doug, are you gonna recite the preamble to the Constitution for us? He tells me that he has memorized it.
Well, I definitely wasn't prepared for the form.
Well, why didn't you tell me you'd memorized it?
Well, I'll give it a shot. By the way, I'm losing my memory. We, the people of Montana, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, for the grandeur of our mountains, and the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve our quality of life, equality of opportunity, and enjoy the blessings of liberty, do hereby ordain and establish this Constitution.
And the only thing he left out, which is really important for this and future generations.